Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Center for Free Expression conversation with Azeezah Kanji. I would want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking with you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression in the Creative School at Ryerson University, I want to welcome you to this fall's first in the Center for Free Expression's In Conversation series, a series featuring prominent guests discussing important issues in the current political moment in which democracy is under threat, public discourse on vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming ideological bubbles, and censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. I want to also thank the co-sponsors of today's event, the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. We greatly appreciate your support. Our conversation today, as I mentioned, features Azeezah Kanji, and the title is Countering Islamophobia in Canada, after 20 years of the War on Terror. Azeezah Kanji is a widely recognized writer and essayist, a legal academic, and serves as Director of Programming at the Noor Cultural Centre in Toronto, a center for Islamic practice and learning and celebration of Islamic culture, while respecting the diversity in peoples and religions. Her work focuses on racism, law, and social justice. Azeezah received her JD degree from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and her Master's of Law, specializing in Islamic law, from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her writing has appeared in Al Jazeera English, Haaretz, Toronto Star, Truth Out, National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Open Democracy, iPolitics, I could go on, as well as in various academic anthologies and journals. It's an honor to have you with us today, Azeezah. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jim. And it's an honor to be here with the community at the Center for Free Expression at X University, that X marking the strength of resistance and the vibrant spirit of resistance at this university. So thank you so much, Jim.
Well, thank you. Azeezah will be in conversation with Tim McSorley. Tim is the national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, working to advance the coalition's mandate to defend civil liberties in Canada from the impact of national security and anti-terrorism laws. Tim holds a bachelor's in journalism and political science from Concordia University and is the former coordinator of both the Media Cooperative and subsequently the Voices Voix coalition. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me here, and really looking forward to this conversation with Azeezah, and really appreciate the really important discussions that the Center for Free Expression has been organizing over the past years.
Well, thank you, Tim. So for today's program, after about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation with Azeezah, Tim will turn to the audience to bring you into the conversation. As you listen to their conversation, if you have a question at any point that you would like addressed when we turn to the audience, if you could look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. All you'll need to do at any point is click on the Q&A tab and write down your question as you think of it. You don't have to wait till Tim announces that we're turning the audience. Just put down the questions as they come up in the course of their conversation. I think that's all I have. So now it's time to hear from Azeezah and Tim. I look forward to your conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Jim. So this topic is a pretty wide-ranging one, Azeezah. But I think the first thing we want to talk about is maybe the most basic and important concept here, and that's exactly what is Islamophobia. There's a lot of discussion about what it means and what it entails, and you've written a lot about what it is and what it isn't and how it's used. And so I was hoping that you'd be able to share your thoughts on what exactly Islamophobia is to kind of frame the conversation for today.
Thank you so much, Tim. And it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you yet again, a continuation of our shared struggles and discourse to try and come to terms with the construction of anti-Muslim racism in Canada. What is Islamophobia? Sounds like a simple question. And like most seemingly simple questions, the very simplicity, the very apparent simplicity of it conceals the fact that the common sense answers we give to it actually import many of the very same dynamics of power, of repression, of oppression that are at the very root of Islamophobia and that in fact sustain it. So when we talk about Islamophobia, we tend to talk about it in a very restricted way, which is precisely what ensures its continuation in its most deep, pervasive, and powerful forms. When we talk about Islamophobia, we tend to restrict it in terms of its scope. We talk about it primarily as a phenomenon of the far right or of right-wing extremists, or even restricted to particular political leaders like Stephen Harper, ignoring how Islamophobia actually transcends the political spectrum, is deeply rooted not only in far right-wing extremist movements, but is anchored in so many of the policies and practices of the national security state that have been premised upon the devaluation and suspicion of Muslim life. And it is precisely this transpartisan appeal of Islamophobia, which is the source of its power, the fact that it has ideas in it that can appeal to people across the political spectrum, from the left to the right. To me, it was very telling when Kelly Leitch, a conservative MP and candidate a few years ago, proposed a Canadian values test. And this was, represented as something that's emblematic of right-wing nationalist politics, but actually voters across the political spectrum appeared to agree with it. But the things they supported about it, they supported it for different reasons. It was implicitly an anti-Muslim test, testing Muslims for their compatibility with Canadian values. But so on the right, the things they thought it was important to test Muslims and other immigrants for was things like patriotism and nationalism and fidelity to the Canadian state. On the left, the things they thought it was important to test people for were things like gender equality, support for women's rights, support for gay rights. And so it is precisely because there is something in it for almost everyone that is what gives Islamophobia its broad-based appeal, but also what makes it difficult to recognize, because the very things that are represented as being the response to or the antithesis of Islamophobia, for example, liberal politics as opposed to conservative politics, actually often end up participating in and reproducing so many of the very same Islamophobic tropes. And so when we ask what is Islamophobia, it's important that we start from a position not simply looking at what are perhaps the most overt or obvious manifestations of Islamophobia, someone like an Alexandra Bissonnette or a Nathaniel Veltman, those who commit the condemned violences of overt physical violence on Muslims, but instead we have to look at the entire spectrum of condoned violences against Muslims, those discourses and those practices which have normalized the idea that the suspicion and disposability of Muslims is not only forgivable, is not only natural, but actually is something to be applauded, is something that's beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you're so right, just with what you start around this idea that it's so, in the simplicity, it's actually so complicated, and that it crosses so many aspects of the political spectrum and various communities. We just finished an election, so I think maybe we'll come back to that later on to maybe get your thoughts on some of the more contemporary issues around it. But we have framed this talk as being Islamophobia since 9/11. And there's a particular way that people talk about Islamophobia now, but I wanted to get your sense of what has maybe changed, and also you've written about the historical roots of Islamophobia, and I was wondering if you could talk about how that kind of complicates our ideas of Islamophobia a little bit more too.
So you mentioned the title of this talk, and I think it's so right. Precisely what we need to be doing is interrogating the very terms by which we have the conversation in the first place, because those terms import so many of the basic presuppositions that limit our understanding of Islamophobia and other forms of racism and intersections between anti-Muslim racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. They restrict our understanding of these as structures and the way that they intersect, and therefore they often keep us trapped in reproducing many of the same systems and structures of knowledge and practice as produced them in the first place. And so we called this talk Countering Islamophobia after 20 years of the war on terror. And we know a predominant discourse when people talk about Islamophobia, including, we just marked the 20th anniversary of the horrific 9/11 attacks in the United States. And we know that a perennial theme in these remembrances of 9/11, even critical essays, going back to the point that often many of the same presuppositions in the way we talk about Islamophobia are shared across the political spectrum. Even critical reflections on 9/11 and the response and the war on terror frequently represent Islamophobia as something that's new, as something that started after 9/11. And what this does is that it inadvertently represents anti-Muslim racism as a response to Muslim violence, rather than a logic that has been deeply built into the way that modern Western states have been organized. And therefore, instead of it being a response to 9/11, in fact, informed the way that 9/11 was represented and the responses to 9/11 were constructed. So we know, for example, even just going back a short while before 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing in the United States, committed by white supremacist Timothy McVeigh, was also originally attributed to Muslims, who had commentators on TV saying that this bears all the hallmarks of Arab terrorism. And then in the legislative response to that, we saw how the punitive impulse was directed not towards, quote unquote, what we would now call domestic terrorists. And I think we can interrogate the apparent use of terrorism discourse to now talk about white supremacists later and the problems with that. But when we look at the legislative response to Oklahoma City, it wasn't directed towards inward securitization. It was directed towards greater securitization and penalization of immigrants and racialized people. And so the idea that racist legislation that we saw after 9/11 was a response to the Muslimness of the perpetrators is really defied by the fact that when we look throughout history, even acts of violence that haven't been committed by Muslims have ended up in greater securitization of Muslims and others. And what this points to is a need to analyze, interrogate, understand the very deep roots of the sort of demonizing and other representations of Muslims in the historical discourse that shapes the way that we respond to the present moment. We began this event, like many events in Canada begin, with a land acknowledgement of the fact that we are having this conversation about racism, about anti-Muslim racism on land that in a country like at the heart of which lies the genocidal erasure of Indigenous sovereignty. And often we Indigenous people have critiqued the fact that non-Indigenous people will give a land acknowledgement and then move on from it, as if the rest of the conversation isn't structured by this fundamental underlying fact of the genocidal racist foundations of the Canadian state. And when we look at those anti-Indigenous foundations of the Canadian state, we see that going back centuries, they're intertwined with anti-Muslim racism. So the infamous doctrine of discovery, which is Europeans' self-conferred imprimatur to treat lands that had been lived on and governed by Indigenous nations for many thousands of years as terra nullius with no sovereigns on them. And that still continues to form the legal basis for Canadian state sovereignty. That doctrine of discovery was in part informed by papal precedents that were wielded against Muslims and Jews during the Crusades to justify dispossession of their lands and enslavement of Muslim and Jewish people. Christopher Columbus, in 1492, when he left Spain, sailed the ocean blue to pseudo-discover the quote-unquote New World. He was leaving a context of Spanish Inquisition against Jews and Muslims in what had formerly been Muslim-ruled Spain. And many of those same tactics of genocide, of dismantling communities, of destroying a people, many of those same tactics of genocide that were perfected against the Jews and the Muslims in Al-Andalus, in formerly Muslim-ruled Spain, were then exported across the ocean and applied against indigenous peoples, tactics such as book burning and sexual demonization, knowing that the way that you rip apart and break a people is to rip apart the bonds of learning and love that connect them. Christopher Columbus himself, the port that he was leaving at when he embarked on this fateful journey that was to end in widespread genocide in the New World, as he left from the same port, Jews were being shipped out of Spain as part of the Inquisition at the very same time. And European legal scholars, such as in the famous or infamous debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Gines de Sepúlveda, which is marked as a foundational moment in international law, because it was the first time in international law that that legal scholars debated on the humanity and on the rights of those who were deemed savages or barbarians. It was with respect to the types of violence that could be unleashed on the indigenous peoples of the New World. And in debating the humanity of indigenous peoples, one of their primary points of reference was Muslims, who they then referred to as Saracens. And so one of the primary questions that they asked themselves were, are indigenous peoples should be treated like enemies, like the Saracens, i.e. the Muslims, and therefore to be massacred? Or can they be saved, unlike the Saracens, and therefore they should be subject to forceful conversion? But of course, if they don't convert, then that's seen as a sign of recalcitrance, and then we can massacre them anyway. So much of the point of reference for that entire conversation were the previous templates of racism that had been developed, or proto-racism that had been developed in order to rationalize the subjugation and dispossession of Muslim and Jewish communities in the quote-unquote old world, which were then exported to the quote-unquote new world. And again, thinking back to that debate between Sepúlveda and de las Casas, how de las Casas is often represented now as constituting what the liberal pole of the debate. And he's remembered now as a liberal forefather of international law and protection of human rights. Sepúlveda is represented as depicting the harsh, punitive, more racist side of the debate. But we see how across the spectrum, again, there was a fundamental agreement, A, on the status of Muslims, and B, on the permissibility and even necessity of subjugating indigenous peoples, which is a pattern of argumentation that, going back to the first question that we discussed, a pattern of argumentation that continues today. And so when we talk about 9/11, or when we talk about Islamophobia as a post 9/11 phenomenon, it really erases the deep roots of anti-Muslim racism that have shaped fundamental concepts in international law, concepts like the idea of sovereignty, concepts like the permissibility of the use of force and violence, in ways that continue to live on in the way that power and violence are structured today, and that were not a response to 9/11, but structured the way that 9/11 was responded to, in a way that, as we see recently in Afghanistan, but also in Iraq, the ravages of Yemen, has unleashed so much colonial destruction and devastation across the world.
Thank you. Wow, that really puts it in a much broader context. It makes
to understand anything, you need to go back to the 15th century, Tim.
It seems like it, and really, it really roots Islamophobia and as you said, that the struggles against colonialism in Canada right now as a system that comes from the same roots. And I think that's definitely not something that I learned in my history classes, growing up, and I think it's a context and a link that would be well included into maybe university and college classes, but even going back to high
school. Well, we didn't learn it in law school. We didn't learn it in law school either. There's a well-known book. If anyone is interested in learning more about this, there's a book by a foundational scholar of international law named Anthony Angie called Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law. And learning international law in law school, we read maybe 1 or 2 pages from this book in the entire curriculum. It was the only readings on colonialism in the entire curriculum, even though colonialism has been so central in shaping the way international law is developed. We read these 1 or 2 pages, and it completely shifted my perspective. And I think part of the reason why we have such a limited, restricted perspective on these things is precisely because of these knowledges that have been erased.
Okay, right. That's very interesting. Maybe we can, we'll share later on, maybe, or when we share the video, we can include some of the readings and books, and we'll get that online. But I like how you put it before about, and I hope I get this right, the idea that 9/11 didn't cause Islamophobia, but rather it shaped how Islamophobia, I guess, continued and how those laws came into place. And so through the work that we do at ICLMG, we focus a lot on anti-terrorism laws and that framing of it, which is maybe, could be how, what is new since 9/11 and that framing. Although, as you said, it goes back to the Oklahoma City bombing. But I was wondering if you do feel, and in what ways there was any kind of shift after 9/11, like what did we see, or what have we seen concretely change, either I guess in the approach to Islamophobia, or I guess even more broadly, what Islamophobic approaches were used to justify bringing in the war on terror and its various aspects, either both Canadian and internationally.
Certainly, there have been shifts. And, I think in talking about continuities and the longue durée of structures, I think it's also important, although sometimes challenging, it's important that we not represent racism as this static, solid structure that persists unchanged throughout time, because then that's self-defeating in terms of our ability to challenge it. Racism does change, it does shift, it responds to challenges and crises from outside of it that are precipitated by anti-racist activism, and it adapts itself to the situations, right, and the current politics of the time. So, in saying that Islamophobia is centuries old, it doesn't mean that it's a static structure that's persisted throughout time. In fact, it continuously needs to reproduce itself in order to survive. And because of that need for continuing reproduction, there are also shifts in its structure and its logic, as we've seen with the war on terror, but there are also opportunities to intervene and to reshape it and to challenge it. And then the challenge with that, and I think we'll talk about this later to telegraph what some of our future conversation is going to be, but the challenge with that then is to ensure that the crises that we produce in the structure of racism, the challenges, aren't simply resorbed back into that system of racism in order to reinforce and strengthen it. But so going back to some of the changes that were produced by 9/11, obviously one of the major things it did was that it made quote unquote racial profiling overtly permissible, where the validity of explicitly interrogating, casting suspicion on, criminalizing on a preemptive basis, and declaring war on Muslims on a preemptive basis was very clearly tied to ideas about race, to interrogations about Muslims' systems of belief and religious practice. So as we saw with counter-radicalization programs, for example, which now have perhaps become less explicitly racist in their formulation, but still retain the basic logic that comes out of that racist approach to suspicion. But early counter-radicalization programs explicitly described markers of Muslim religiosity, like growing a beard, like wearing certain forms of clothes. I remember in the RCMP had produced a document called Radicalization, a guide for the perplexed, even though I think they were probably more perplexed than anyone. I don't think they could be giving guidance to anyone who's perplexed. But in this document, it described wearing hijab, women wearing hijab and forms of modest Muslim dress. It conflated that with expressions of radicalization. In some of the torture cases, the complicity with torture cases in Canada that we saw, men like Maher Arar, Almalki Noorudin, who were tortured not only with the complicity of Canadian security agencies, but also with the help of information that was provided by Canadian security agencies. We saw things like the fact that that Almaty had made a will before going on his Hajj pilgrimage, which is a standard practice among Muslims. I know my grandfather made a will before every time he went on Hajj, so he would be considered a terrorist 7 times over. Those types of things were represented as marks of being a suspicious Muslim, things that were very clearly connected to just mainstream standard Muslim practice. And so one of the things that the War on Terror did was that it took these pre-existing systems of criminalization and tied them to very overt forms of racial profiling in a way which made it more acceptable to think about certain racial markers as in and of themselves being signs of threat or of danger. Normally when we talk about racial profiling in the policing context, for example, the assumption is that, and I think this is a problematic assumption, but the assumption is that it's not the way that the crimes are constituted themselves that are racist, but it's the way that they're being enforced and applied. So that people end up wrongfully being, stopped, harassed, criminalized, but on the basis of crimes that aren't themselves racial or racialized in the way that they've been constructed. But what we see with the War on Terror is, I think it very explicitly shows the racialized nature of the construction of crime, because I think the concept of terrorism in the way that it's been institutionalized has no meaning aside from and outside of racialized ideas about violence, about whose violence is considered barbaric, illegitimate, and whose violence is considered to be legitimate. So when we look at the way that, or what's been considered terrorism on the part of Muslims, Muslim fighters attacking US soldiers has been deemed terrorism, even though under the international laws of war, soldiers are considered legitimate targets of military violence. We can debate whether law should be legitimizing war fundamentally as an exercise of violence in the first place, but within this system of regulation of violence that we have, soldiers are considered legitimate targets. And yet even Muslims attacking soldiers is considered an act of terrorism, whereas the US government killing Muslim civilians in Somalia and Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq, that's not considered terrorism. In fact, it's considered counterterrorism. And those deaths are dismissed as collateral damage, or even more insultingly, are labeled enemies killed in action. So those kinds of disparities in the way that the concept of terrorism itself has been formulated, I think shows the way that crime in general is a deeply racialized construction at its core. And what the War on Terror has done is made some of those expressions too obvious to ignore, and has really made it plain what the disparities in the way that state violence is regulated in a colonial system.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And I think it's so important to be talking about the idea of state violence and the difference between what's considered terrorism and then state violence never being viewed as a form of terrorism. And I was hoping maybe you could talk a bit more about the idea. So often Islamophobia, even in the context of post 9/11, it's framed as an individual act of hate, that individuals embody Islamophobia. But there is also an incredible problem with systemic Islamophobia, state-sanctioned Islamophobia, and also those contradictions around what's considered terrorism, what's considered state-sanctioned violence. So I was wondering if you could kind of pull that and tear that apart a little bit more too.
I think that really gets to the core of a lot of the problems with the conversations that we're having right now, when what's represented as a progressive move is the ability to call certain acts of private individual violence by white supremacists, perhaps terrorism, as we've seen with Nathaniel Veltman. But the very premise of that is severing the racist violence of the individual private actor, the individual Islamophobe, from the entire structure of Islamophobic violence, which has legitimized these ideas, legitimized the premise that Muslims pose a threat. And therefore, as Alexandre Bissonnette said, he thought that it would be more acceptable for him to go shoot up a mosque than to shoot up a mall, as he originally was thinking of doing, because he thought he would be sure to hit a terrorist if he shot up a mosque instead of a mall. That's a reflection not only of his own individual perspective, but the fact that he thought it would be more socially acceptable, I think, is a damning indictment of the social context that has produced such a perspective, and really should motivate us to look towards the deeper structures of Islamophobia that have normalized and legitimized such ideas. So talking about state violence, it's interesting that when the term Islamophobia was originally coined in the context of the French Revolution, as the critical geographer Stuart Eldon points out, it was actually referring to the violence of the state. And some etymologists argue that the word territory, referring to the modern territory of the nation state, and the word terror or terrorism actually come from the same root, that territory was land from which political power terrorized others from coming. And so there was this acknowledgement that if we're talking about violence, the biggest capacity of violence is that wielded by the state. And therefore, if we're looking at things from a principled perspective, we can't separate the violence of the state and treat it as negligible, or rather as inherently legitimate, that its legitimacy is beyond question, and therefore it becomes impossible to think of it as terrorism. In fact, the situation is exactly the opposite, that the state has the greatest capacity for violence. And so when we're considering the potential illegitimacy of violence, the state should be the very first place that we're looking. Lisa Stamnitsky, who's a scholar who's traced the history of the concept of terrorism in her book, Disciplining Terror, points out that while a few decades ago, terrorism was understood as a tactic of using violence against civilians that any party could use. It didn't necessarily contain this intense moral condemnation and sense of inherent illegitimacy that we now have, particularly post 9/11 in the era of the war on terror. Rather, it was understood as a tactic that multiple different parties could use, including states. And so we could think about state-sponsored terrorism, the fact that the US, for example, was sponsoring death squads in Latin America as part of its imperial policies. That could be understood as a form of state-sponsored terrorism. But there's been an evolution in the concept of terrorism, accelerated and entrenched after 9/11, but I think preceding it, largely tied to Israel's efforts to delegitimize Palestinian resistance to settler colonization, occupation, and apartheid as terrorism. There's been a shift in the concept of terrorism so that it now connotes inherently illegitimate, immoral violence that is conducted and wielded by evil actors who are not like us. And therefore, under this new framework, terrorism could never be the purview or the practice of a state like Canada, because Canada is on the other side of terrorism. Their violence isn't terrorism, it's inherently counterterrorism. But it's important that we denaturalize these concepts. Again, thinking about racism and the fact that it shifts over time, the fact that we can see a development and evolution in the way that terrorism has been understood, from originally being rooted in state violence and state-sponsored violence to now being understood as something that the state can wield tremendous amounts of exceptional violence in the name of suppressing. When we see this kind of evolution, it helps us to denaturalize the way that we understand concepts like terrorism, which are often taken for granted, taken as common sense. There's a case in Canada, in Canadian courts, in the immigration context, in which before the word terrorism was defined in Canadian law, immigrants could still be excluded from Canada on the basis of terrorism, but it wasn't defined. And what judges said was that, well, it doesn't matter if there isn't a definition of terrorism. We know what it is when we see it. It is precisely those things that we think we know it when we see it. Those are the very concepts which are most in need of interrogation. And so looking at the history of terrorism enables us to conduct that kind of interrogation, to see the contingency and also the political interests behind the understanding of terrorism that we now have today, one that is primarily focused on the violence of non-state Muslim actors that has also been wielded to demonize and suppress Indigenous land and water protectors in Canada. And so that, that vicious circle of anti-Muslim racism informing anti-Indigenous racism, which anti-Indigenous racism then informed many of the practices of the war on terror, which are now being wielded against Indigenous land and water protectors. That vicious circle continues. But we also know terrorism has been understood differently in the past, and therefore it can and should be understood differently in the future, and that also we shouldn't take it for granted as a natural category of political violence. Rather, it's something that's been constructed to serve a particular political purpose, and therefore our work is to engage in that critical interrogation of it and the ends that it's being put towards.
That's really interesting. And one thing that I've noticed recently around the anniversary of 9/11 is there's been seems to be some discussion about, are we moving away from this idea of terrorism? And I'm wondering, have you seen that? Have you seen, over the past few years, as we kind of get further from 9/11, are there changes in the idea of terrorism, or of it being specifically, as you said before, linked to ideas of Islam and being linked to Muslims? Or are we just seeing, kind of more of the same, or new categories of violence being created in order to keep terrorism linked, to Muslim or so-called, Muslim-linked violence?
I think we're seeing the naturalization and entrenchment of the concept of terrorism and the counterterrorism apparatus that's been built up around that. And we see that currently in the responses to white supremacist violence, where even anti-racist organizations, left-wing political parties like the NDP, who had 20 years ago been stringent critics of the counterterrorism apparatus, are now proposing that we wield this very same apparatus in order to fight white supremacist individuals and organizations. We saw this recently with a struggle that we were involved in together around terrorist entities listings, the push to now have white supremacist organizations listed as terrorist entities on this very problematic listing tool, which can rely on secret evidence, uses executive power to list entities as terrorists in ways that have very serious consequences for the entities listed, financial suppression. There are groups on there, for example, Irfan, which is a Muslim charity that was listed for donations primarily of medical equipment to Gaza. Groups like Irfan are still on there, but because of the financial consequences of listing, it's been very difficult for them to even mount any kind of legal opposition to their listing, to challenge their listing in a court of law, because their assets have been frozen and because donations to them are potentially criminalized as support of a listed terrorist entity. And so all of those problems, all of the Muslim centricism of the list still persists, but we have left-wing actors, some anti-racists, suggesting that instead of fixing these fundamental problems with the list and the abuses of state power that it enables, instead of addressing these issues, they're now purporting to use this as an anti-racism tool. And the danger with this is that it ends up masking the continuing racialization, the continuing structural racism of the apparatus instead of rectifying it. So the terrorist entities list, at the same time as these few white supremacist organizations were added, several more Muslim identified organizations were added at the same time, including a group from Kashmir, facing, Kashmiris might engage in violence, but they're facing a context of overwhelming state terrorism at the hands of India's military occupation, the highest concentration of soldiers, I think, anywhere in the world. It's an occupation that has more soldiers than America's occupation of Iraq at the height of it. And so to label the violence of non-state Kashmiri actors terrorism in that context, while occluding the violence of the occupation that they are subject to, really exemplifies the way that the discourse of terrorism is being used to obscure state violence. And none of those problems are addressed by simply adding a few white supremacist groups to the list. Similarly, the prosecution of Nathaniel Veltman, who was the man who committed the horrendous van attack in London, Ontario, which killed almost an entire Muslim family that was out for a walk on a public sidewalk. He's being prosecuted as a terrorist, but when we look at the charges that have been leveled against them, we still see a fundamental disparity between the way that he's being treated versus the way that Muslims prosecuted for terrorism have been treated. So he has been charged with a provision that makes it automatically first-degree murder when a killing is committed in the context of a terrorist act. But he likely would have been charged with first-degree murder anyway, because there was evidence of premeditation, evidence of the requisite intent for first-degree murder. So it doesn't really change the way that he's being criminalized. And most importantly, he is being prosecuted for an act of violence that has already been committed. Whereas when you look at the prosecutions of Muslims for terrorism, and 98% of completed terrorism prosecutions in Canada are of Muslims, even though they've been responsible for less than 10% of deaths from terrorism and political violence in Canada since 9/11. Therefore, when you look at the way that Muslims have been prosecuted for terrorism, they're not for acts of violence already committed. They're for incipient plots. They're for acts that are very distant from any kind of completed violence, from any kind of death or injury. Often, they've involved extensive involvement by state informants who have been intrinsic and instrumental, fundamental to constructing the plot in the first place. Often they've involved the targeting of people who are struggling with mental illness and mental health issues, who are targeted not in spite of their vulnerability, but precisely because of their vulnerability. And this is, there's the case of Abdurrahman al-Banasawi right now. I encourage you all to learn more about it. He was a youth who was targeted because of his struggles with because of his mental health struggles. And he's incarcerated in intensive solitary confinement conditions, a form of torture according to the UN in the United States, and his family is struggling to bring him back home. So white supremacists aren't being subject to any kind of that preemptive race-based criminalization, nor should they be. And so that very fact that it would be abhorrent to resolve this disparity by instead criminalizing white supremacists in the way that Muslims have been criminalized. As a Muslim who is very scared of white supremacists, I don't want anyone to be treated the way that Muslims have been treated in the post 9/11 context. I think it's legally extremely problematic, and we shouldn't be institutionalizing these ways of aggrandizing state power by enabling it to engage in preemptive criminalization. And we also shouldn't be allowing the state to have an alibi to mask its ongoing racism and its operations of counterterrorism by throwing a few white supremacists into the mix on the margins. Instead, we have to continue our efforts to dismantle this racist infrastructure that has been built up, particularly post 9/11, and that is now also being wielded against Indigenous land and water defenders who continue to bear the brunt of genocidal violence that lies at the heart of the Canadian state.
Well, thanks, Azeezah. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And, this idea of the further entrenchment of anti-terrorism laws that have and can in the future be used against, not just a Muslim community, but other racialized communities. I know we've talked about, the two of us, about how, the justification and the terrorist entities list could eventually be used against Black Lives Matter protesters, like, who are, you know, an anti-fascist activists who are constantly referred to as terrorists by, you know, select pundits and even politicians. That there's a real question about how we counter these systems. And I think we'll go to questions fairly soon, but, you know, I think that touches on it really well on the kind of second part of the title around countering Islamophobia. And so I guess I know it's
the first part of the title, but it's what we haven't talked about.
Well, I guess it's the first part, but we haven't got into. But so what we have then is it seems a state approach to countering Islamophobia that's relying on security and policing. And on one hand, it seems to have a lot of support because for, you know, often it's framed as the last 2 decades, terrorism has been framed as only being about, you know, Muslim perpetrators of violence. And now it's, you know, equality, that it's now being used against, you know, to criminalize white supremacist violence. And so you've touched on that really well, I think. But I guess in that context, you know, what are some of the ways that you think, or some of the things we could be pushing the government to do, or maybe rather doing ourselves, in order to change that reference to how we counter Islamophobia? And I would imagine it, you know, when we're doing this, it's not just limited to countering Islamophobia, but really countering, you know, racism and anti-Muslim racism, but also anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, that, you know, doesn't fall into this security trap, if I can put it that way.
You know, so much of the way that the government talks about countering Islamophobia, it's as if Islamophobia is a phenomenon outside itself that it needs to address, rather than something that's emanating from its own policies, structures, and practices. It reminds me of Justin Trudeau, for example, marching in the climate march to demand stronger action on climate change, as if he hasn't been at the helm of a government which has been responsible for perpetuating those very same policies of tar sands exploitation, for example, that are furthering the climate crisis. And so similarly, when it comes to Islamophobia, and we saw this at the Islamophobia Summit, Islamophobia is represented as something that's outside of the government, which the government is now going to wield its apparatuses of power to address, rather than something that's been embedded in the apparatus of power in the first place. So at the Islamophobia Summit, we saw absolutely no conversation around these abusive national security laws, things like no-fly lists, for example, terrorist entities listings, peace bonds, preemptive prosecutions, counter-radicalization programs. This whole entire panoply of securitization and preemptive criminalization that's been developed was completely off the table for consideration. No discussion of the revelations of rampant racism, including anti-Muslim racism, that has been exposed as existing within the very same security agencies, which are now being represented as the experts on how to address anti-Muslim extremism. And so then we have the paradox, or the apparent paradox, of people like Stephanie Carvin and Jessica Davis, people who have been responsible for legitimating this extremely damaging, demonizing concept of Muslim extremism, now being cited as the experts we turn to on how to address anti-Muslim extremism. Stephanie Carvin, for God's sake, baked cakes celebrating drone deaths, and now she's on TV talking about how we address Islamophobia. Jessica Davis wrote op-eds demonizing Rahab Dagmosh, who was a Syrian woman struggling with schizophrenia, who waved a golf club and a knife around in a Canadian Tire, causing no serious injuries, was charged with 12 terrorism offenses. And Jessica Davis was using this to promote the idea that, oh, it's not only Muslim men that we have to be worried about, it's Muslim women too who are also a threat. And again, this is represented as equalization, as feminist equality, that Muslim women can be terrorists too. Oh, thank you for the empowerment of that. And so, because we have this framework within which Islamophobia is represented as a private phenomenon, we're stuck in this, or the state tries to stick us in this trap of then appealing to the structures of state violence that are the sources of Islamophobia as being the solutions to Islamophobia. the brilliant abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore coined the term the anti-state state to capture the way in which people advocating for the shrinking of the structure of the state actually end up aggrandizing and enforcing the powers of the state, such as policing and military, in order to tamp down and control the chaos and mayhem that results from the withdrawal of the state from actually providing welfare from its citizens. So that's the anti-state state. What we have with Trudeau is what we could call the anti-racist state, which is in the name of forwarding anti-racism, we see the state building up the very apparatuses of power that are the technologies of state racism in the first place. And while this looks maybe like a paradox on the face of it, actually what it shows is it's the hallmark of power is that it occupies the entire field of possibilities. So whether it's being racist or whether it's being anti-racist, it's the same settler colonial state that's being built up. And that's what, as non-state anti-racists, that's what we need to keep our eye on, to not be seduced by the claims of anti-racism of the state, but instead to look at operationally is what the government is proposing, things like terrorist entities listings, things like now the online harms legislation, which threatens to increase censorship of Indigenous, Black, Muslim, Palestinian speech online in the name of protecting communities from hate. Instead, we have to get behind the state's anti-racist discourse and instead look structurally at what is it accomplishing. Is this expanding tools of state power that are likely to be deployed primarily against racialized, colonized, and marginalized communities? And so when it comes to addressing the racist state infrastructure of the war on terror, the things that we're calling for, they're not new things. They're the same things that civil liberties and anti-racism organizations have been calling for since the institutionalization of these things 20 years ago, right? It's calling for greater transparency, greater accountability. We don't even have the most basic transparency when it comes to these measures, such that we don't even have basic information disclosure from security agencies about their targeting practices. While Muslim communities are made to be ever more transparent to surveillance, all of these state practices, which should be subject to accountability, remain hidden, opaque, behind walls of secrecy, misinformation, disinformation. These are the most basic things that people have been calling for the last 20 years, and yet the government perpetually acts like it's starting anew, like it's hearing about Islamophobia for the first time, simply because it doesn't want to respond to what people on the ground have long been saying are the actual sources of Islamophobia, which are the practices of the state itself.
Right. I think that, yeah, that's really powerful, important. I think really, clarifies where we need to be going and what we need to watch out for when it comes to, the government and state discourse around countering Islamophobia. And I think that might be a good place to maybe, open it up to questions if there are any right now. Ange, do you have a first question for Azeezah?
Yeah, I do. And I just want to remind the attendees that you can ask questions using the Q&A at any point. So the first question is from Eleanor, and Eleanor asks, why do we use the word Islamophobia instead of anti-Muslim racism? It seems to me that Islamophobia appears to focus on a fear which has no justification.
Thank you. So that's an excellent question. And personally, I prefer the term anti-Muslim racism. I think it captures more of the dynamics of what's happening with it. But the reason why Islamophobia is used is simply because it's recognized as the term that captures this phenomenon. And all words ultimately are social constructions. For example, anti-Semitism, which refers to anti-Jewish racism and oppression, isn't literally talking about racism directed towards all Semites, which would include Arabs. It's understood to mean anti-Jewish racism. And so Islamophobia similarly is understood to mean anti-Muslim racism. And in fact, we see how perpetual debates over the terminology that we used is used to constantly defer any action on the actual phenomenon. But on the interrelated point that you raise about one of the dangers with the term Islamophobia is that it represents anti-Muslim racism as an irrational phobia. That's extremely important for us to keep in mind when we use this term, because so often, even in the definitions of Islamophobia, it's defined as irrational fear or hatred of Muslims, as if, again, it's just the purview of certain irrational fringe individuals, rather than something that has been built into the rationality of power and the way that power has been organized. And so even as we use terms, we spoke earlier about how it's important to constantly interrogate the very terms by which we're having the conversation in the first place, to analyze them for the hidden biases, as well as the questions and fields of conversation that they exclude by their very terms of reference. Similarly, it's important that we constantly interrogate the way that we're using language. Are we using Islamophobia to connote something that's irrational, that's separate from the way that the sovereign state has been built up, that's separate from the way that violence has been justified consistently, particularly over the last 20 years? If so, then we need to remind ourselves that Islamophobia is in fact not irrational, but has been constitutive of the rationality of power, violence, and oppression, particularly over the last 20 years. I can also add something that, and Tim and I have been talking about this recently in the way that conversations around Islamophobia are framed, is that another critique of the term Islamophobia is often that it focuses on Islam, and a common leitmotif of especially the far right is that, well, it's not Islamophobia if it's a legitimate fear of Islam, and Islam is legitimately something that we should be scared of. And so this focus on critiquing the centering of Islam and the concept of Islamophobia is used to delegitimize the concept or the idea that Islamophobia is a form of racism against Muslims. Instead, it's represented as being legitimate critique of a religious system, which therefore cannot be racism. And in fact, this is a false separation between racial and religious demonization, othering, and oppression. When we look to the historic roots of the way that modern racism has developed in justifying systems of colonialism and enslavement, which form the basis for modern notions of biological racism, when we look at the long history of this, we see how intimately, fundamentally, it's been intertwined with the type of religious proto-racist discourse that's been wielded for centuries against Muslims and Jews to justify violence against them within and around Europe, and which was then exported to other situations. And so racism and these types of religious discourses have for a very long time been intertwined, and it's a false separation to say that because Islamophobia is about Islam, therefore it's not racism. Rather, it's that these types of representations of Islam as inherently and exceptionally violent and inherently and exceptionally patriarchal, those themselves are the markers of a racist way of talking about a religion in a way that exceptionalizes it while ignoring the violence, while ignoring the patriarchy that's been built into the structures of power and governance within that which is represented as the antithesis of Islam, which is the West.
Thanks, Azeezah. Yeah, I know just the other day we were talking and you shared that with me about the history and the links between, the modern ideas of racism and, either anti-Muslim hate or Islamophobia and the roots of it in kind of religious kind of persecution. And I never heard that before. And I think it's a really, it really speaks to and really helps to shut down this idea that, well, you can't be racist against Muslims because it's not a race. We hear that a lot. And I think that really clarifies how, yes, you can be racist against Muslims. It's not that's not just, making something up, but it's really, what we see.
Well, and also one of the reasons why racism became more biological in its formulation rather than focused on religion is because the European colonial powers found a need then to be able to justify forms of violence and enslavement against indigenous people, against Black people who were converted to Christianity. And so then religion alone became inadequate as a basis to justify these forms of violence and exploitation, which were foundational in building up the economic and political structures of Western states. And so these things have been connected, intertwined with each other for centuries. And it's really a product of that erasure of knowledge that we can continue to separate them and then delegitimize critiques of Islamophobia on the basis of the idea that it's primarily about Islam as a religion rather than Muslims as a people. You can't separate the way that Islam has been represented as a religion from the way from the types of violence that are then enabled against Muslims as people.
Right. Okay, I think there might be another question. Ange, are there more questions for Azeezah?
Yeah, the next one is from Drew, and Drew asked, does Canadian participation in British interventions against the Mahdist revolt in Sudan play any role in the historical formation of Canadian Islamophobia? Is there anything we can learn from it today?
I don't know much about the Canadian participation in that British intervention. I'm so sorry, but in general, some good resources on the connections between colonial interventions, anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Indigenous racism include Ramon Grossfogel's essay, The Four Epistemicides, which connects these different forms of violence in the constitution of colonial modernity, and Nelson Maldonado Torres's work on the relationship between religion and race in forming the modern world. And I think those provide good frameworks for understanding then the way that any particular intervention or act of violence should be understood as shaping the contemporary situation. So I'm so sorry, I don't know much about that particular intervention. I'd love to learn more about it from you and hear about if you're doing research on it and to send me any resources on it. And so I'm sorry that all I can do is maybe point to some of the general framing texts through which we would understand the impact of any particular intervention. Tim, do you know anything about this?
I don't know, so I think we'll leave it we'll leave it at that, and maybe see if there's another question from the audience.
Yeah, the next one is from Hani, and Hani asks, is there a relationship between contemporary Islamophobia and what Edward Said described as Orientalism?
Certainly, there's a very strong connection. And first of all, starting with the fact, or it's important for us to note that Orientalism was written several decades before 9/11. Edward Said's other foundational texts on demonizing representations of Islam in US media were also written decades before 9/11. And so that's an important reminder that some of the most fundamental works in our understandings of the operation of Islamophobia predate 9/11, which should really signal to us the continuities in this form of racism and the way that it's articulated, the way that it takes shape, the way that the logic of it is constructed. So Said's Orientalism, one of the major points that it made was that the way that Orientalist scholars, and back then Orientalist wasn't considered an insult in the way that it's often considered now, it was constructed as a legitimate field of knowledge production about people in the Orient, that those kinds of oppressive and othering representations that were produced by supposedly neutral scholars, they weren't unmotivated, they weren't words untethered from systems of violence. Instead, they were intimately connected with the types of colonial subjugation which were being unleashed upon the populations that they were talking about. And so similarly, in our context today, I think we have to understand that the way that Muslims are talked about, are described, whether in state texts like in counter-radicalization programs, or in the white supremacist screeds that we see against Muslims and Islam, that these aren't just words that are disconnected from systems of power. And again, coming back to the point about phobia connoting irrationality, that these aren't things that are unmotivated or untethered from material, political, economic motivations. In fact, we see how Islamophobia is intensely profitable for at least certain sectors of the state. We know in the first decade alone after 9/11, an extra $91 billion was spent on national security bodies of the Canadian state in Canada alone, and that's in the first decade of after 9/11 alone. We know, for example, things like the Saudi arms deals are being, which is, Canada was just called out for the second time by a UN panel for its complicity in perpetuating the massacre and the immense suffering that's being unleashed against the people of Yemen. That Islamophobia is profitable for certain sectors. And so while often when we focus on Islamophobia at the level of discourse, at the level of words, at the level of addressing certain problematic ideas, in fact, we can't dismantle Islamophobia until we dismantle those material structures which continue to motivate it, which make it profitable, which make it attractive, which make it in fact necessary in order to justify certain types of violence. And I think that that's something that Orientalism very powerfully reminds us of the necessity of, that it's not just about discourse, but it's about discourse tied to systems of power. And as long as those motivated systems of power remain in place, you're going to have these types of representations of Muslims continue to emerge to justify them, which will then be expressed in some of their most extremist forms in the types of mosque massacres, for example, that we've been seeing in the last few years.
Right, okay. Ange, is there another question?
Yeah, the next one is from Robin, and Robin asks, given what you've said about the Canadian state's public embrace of the fight against Islamophobia, what could those of us genuinely wanting to fight anti-Muslim racism be doing?
Thank you so much for that question, because it is so easy to be seduced by the state's articulation of its priorities and its statements of action on what it's doing against Islamophobia. And so it's so important that we look towards the structures of Islamophobia that are embedded in state practice itself. With ICLMG, we've produced a report that we submitted to the National Islamophobia Summit. It's available online at islamophobiais.com. I think it's also available on the ICLMG website, where we analyzed various forms of state-sponsored Islamophobia and then also issued our recommendations about what could be done to address them. But I think first and foremost, beyond any of the particular details, it's important that we maintain an attitude of perpetual skepticism towards the actions that the state is claiming to take to address Islamophobia. It's vital that we constantly interrogate whether, as I said before, these are expanding institutions of state violence or they're actually working to dismantle them. And this is something that I've learned from Black abolitionist scholars, practitioners, activists, such as Mariam Kaba, who put forward a very helpful analysis of, when thinking about in the context of police reforms, what are the types of reforms that we should oppose because they're actually entrenching and aggrandizing police capacities. For example, things like body cams, which end up redirecting more monetary resources towards police. What are the types of reforms that we should oppose versus what are the types of reforms that we can embrace because they're actually working towards dismantlement, abolition of the structures of violence that are the problem in the first place. And so I think we need to undertake similar questioning when thinking about how we intervene to address state Islamophobia. There are some reforms which will be very helpful. And I think one of the first things, one of the preconditions that we need to be calling for in order to address this vast apparatus of state Islamophobia is basic information transparency about, the state doesn't even disclose, for example, how many people and who and when people are placed under peace bonds, which are just to give an example, which are they allow imposition of extremely restrictive conditions such as curfews, prohibition of internet use, requiring people to move, imposition of very stringent conditions without any kind of criminal trial or prosecution. And so this is a very concerning exercise of state power, and yet we don't even have basic data except from researchers who have gone and tried to track these things, but we don't even have basic information about who's being subject to them comprehensively, what types of conditions have been imposed upon people. And so I think as a precondition for any of the work we need to do going forward, basic information transparency is the fundamental thing that we should be calling for. And then I also think it's important that we not separate struggles against anti-Muslim racism from struggles against anti-Indigenous racism, struggles against anti-Black racism, because otherwise what we see happening is that in the name of uplifting or slightly improving the position of one community, it ends up perpetuating the dispossession and the oppression of other communities. So for example, when we call for expansion of policing, expansion of hate crime units, for example, which in many jurisdictions are the very same units which have been tasked with also investigating extremism, a fundamentally Islamophobic concept. And so we have police units which have been trained in Islamophobia and other forms of racism now being treated as the units which are the solution to the racism of hate. But thinking that expanded policing is a solution to Islamophobia not only erases the experiences of Black Muslims who are subject to both the Islamophobia of the state as well as the anti-Black racism of police and other state bodies. It not only erases their experiences, but it also erases the entanglements between anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and Islamophobia. And so it's not simply that using the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, but in fact, often in using some of the master's tools, we end up building up one part of the master's house in the name of addressing or partially deconstructing another part of it. And so that's why it's so important that we have a holistic structural analysis of the way anti-Muslim racism is operating in conjunction with other forms of racism to ensure that we're not reinforcing the structure of the settler colonial racist state as a whole in the name of addressing some forms of racism against Muslims.
Thanks, Azeezah. And if I can just, I'll plug the website you mentioned again. So the report that we submitted together is up on Islamophobia-is.com. But it's a really wonderful, excellent website with a video series around Islamophobia, resources on Islamophobia. And I think, if we're thinking about, talking to others who we know and ensuring that people are thinking about this and engaging with, racism, anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia critically, I'd really suggest that people, take a look at the site and share it with your colleagues, with your family members that maybe need to see it, with friends, and make sure that those resources get out there, because it really, it's an educational tool that I think is really, really important.
Thanks so much, Tim. And I did not pay him to say that, and he's not getting any kind of kickback. So thank you so much, Tim.
No problem. Ange, are there other questions?
Yeah, there are. The next one is from Ahmed, and it's one thing that no politician seems to speak about is the recruitment of Canadian nationals in foreign armies and terrorist groups. For example, what makes joining ISIS illegal, but joining an apartheid terrorist army like the Israeli army is encouraged and funded inside of Canada?
I think your question really gets to the nub of some of the incoherencies in the way that sovereign state violence is fetishized as legitimate, whereas the often much less greater capacities for violence of non-state actors are demonized as quote unquote terrorism. There is actually a campaign at the moment to address the illegal recruiting of soldiers or of participants in the IDF in Canada, because it is technically against the criminal code to recruit for a foreign army in Canada. But again, we see how, despite what you have formally articulated as the law, more deeply seated racial concepts intervene to dictate how the law is applied. So we don't see prohibitions on foreign recruitment until now. Hopefully that will change with this complaint that's been lodged, but we don't see them being reinforced against recruitment for the IDF. Canada technically considers settlements to be illegal and Israel settlements to be contrary to the Geneva Conventions. And yet in the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, goods from the settlements are labeled as made in Israel and accorded the same preferential status as goods that have been made in Israel proper, even though that's flagrantly against resolutions from the UN Security Council and a basic principle in international law that applies to everyone, not just to Israel, but to everyone, that you can't treat a situation that's been created by a gross violation of international law as being legitimate, which is precisely what labeling goods from the settlements does. And so there's two ways that racism is perpetuated through law. One is through overtly racist legal concepts, right? Concepts that are framed in overtly racist terms. I think terrorism has become one of those things where terrorism is basically, for a long time, in the way it's been operationalized, has been a synonym for Muslim violence. And then the other way that racism operates through law, which is much more difficult to detect, is that the law itself appears neutral and universal and applies equally to everyone. And yet these underlying racialized concepts consistently intervene in order to ensure that the law is applied in an uneven way. And so we know that things like the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, the permissibility of recruiting IDF soldiers in Canada, that these are undergirded by these constant representations we hear by Canadian politicians, the Canadian government, that Canada and Israel are partners, that they have the same values, right? The values they claim that they have in common are democracy and freedom and human rights. Of course, we know that the values that they actually have in common are values of settler colonialism and anti-Indigenous oppression and dispossession. Those are the values that unite them. But what it does is it produces a transnational concept of belonging, so that it's seen as, natural that, of course, Canada supports Israel and therefore you would allow the IDF to recruit in Canada, whereas Palestinians, even though officially, we pay lip service to this idea in international law that you can't acquire territory by force, that the settlements are illegitimate. We pay lip service to these ideas, but they're never actually, no life is actually ever breathed into them, because of this underlying racial distinction between Israeli settler colonialists as the legitimate wielders of violence, whereas Palestinians resisting occupation as being illegitimate wielders of violence. And we know, again, looking at the history of the way that the concept of terrorism has developed, so much of the racism that's been built into the concept of terrorism emerges from the efforts of Benjamin Netanyahu in particular and his Jonathan Institute to demonize, delegitimize, disenfranchise Palestinians and Palestinian resistance. So that's the root, the pre-9/11 immediate roots where so much of this is coming from. And so we can't understand the way that racial oppression is operating in the Canadian settler context without understanding the way that racial oppression is operating in the Israeli settler colonial context. So thank you so much for that question.
Thanks, Azeezah. And if people are looking for more independent Jewish voices, has been doing a lot on the issue around IDF recruitment in Canada. And their website is ijvcanada.org. So you can go there and find out more on the issue too.
And they've been working on so many of these other disparities as well. For example, asking, you talked about the disparity between the way that soldiers versus quote unquote terrorists are treated. There's also the disparity in the way that charities are treated. Why is it that groups like the Jewish National Fund, which have explicitly built projects on ethnically cleansed Palestinian land, which is on the other side of the Green Line, which is supposed to be where Israel's sovereignty extends, why is it that charities that are explicitly cementing policies that are in overt contradiction with Canadian official policy, how is it that they have charitable status, yet Muslim charities for donating medical equipment to Gaza get put on terrorist entities lists? So these disparities run throughout the relationship with Israel. Similar disparities also inform Canada's relationship with India and Kashmiris under occupation. It's built into in some ways, it's built into international law and the way that it legitimates some forms of violence and delegitimates others. For those who are interested, there's a couple of really excellent papers on this. One is by Frédéric Maigret called From Savages to Unlawful Combatants. And the other is by Nathaniel Berman called Privileging Combat. So those speak to the sort of general ways within which anti-Indigenous colonial ways of legitimizing some forms of particularly colonial violence, particularly European violence, have been built into the way that the law is organized itself, right? So the law itself isn't neutral. It privileges certain exercises of violence and delegitimizes others, and it has nothing to do with how inherently destructive the form of violence is. It has much more to do with who were the powers in charge of drafting the laws at the time when they were developed. And we know that at the time that the laws of war were developed, much of the world was colonized. The very same powers, such as Britain and France, that are represented as the progenitors, as the fathers of this effort to humanize war, to restrict it, were at the same time inflicting tremendous violence in their colonies. And so they sought to insulate that, to protect that from restrictions that would be introduced in the laws of war. So the law itself isn't neutral, isn't even in terms of the way it recognizes or legitimizes some terms of violence. But then even that already skewed, biased form of law isn't applied equally when it comes to situations like Israel-Palestine. And so it's those crucibles of colonial oppression where we really see the disparities built into law and the way that it often operates to legitimize and serve as an imprimatur to power. And we see it in the Canadian context too, with the treatment of Indigenous land and water defenders as well.
Of course. Thanks. I think we may have time for one more question, Ange, if there's one more, or maybe two if they're quick, but yeah.
Okay, the next one is a two-part question from Nadra. Can you discuss Islamophobia in the media? For example, BBC saying Afghans starving under Taliban, when the truth is that they are starving because IMF and allies blocked aid to Afghanistan. Also, do you think CBC is now less Islamophobic in reporting since a few months ago when that letter from Muslims was circulated to Canadian media to give a fair representation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just want to add, I wanted to touch on that with you, Azeezah, because you were a columnist in the Toronto Star. You write regularly for Al Jazeera. You're in the media, and so I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about how the media's approach is on these issues.
Media is deeply involved in legitimizing and perpetuating Islamophobia. We know study after study after study has found that acts of violence committed by Muslims not only receive far more coverage than acts of violence committed against Muslims or committed by white supremacists, even if the latter are more fatal. the disparities are not only quantitative, they're also qualitative, that acts of violence committed by Muslims are more likely to tie it to the identity of the perpetrator, the religious identity of the perpetrator. They're more likely to connect with other acts of violence, so that Muslim quote unquote terrorism has been represented as an overwhelming phenomenon, as a concerted phenomenon, as opposed to isolated acts of violence. And we know with white supremacist violence, for example, that they're not only represented as isolated acts of violence from each other, but also isolated from the violence of the state itself. Those connections are never made. I think what we saw in the wake of the London van attacks, there was a shift in the discourse, but it's not necessarily an anti-Islamophobic shift. It's more a shift towards masking the Islamophobia of the media. So contrasting the coverage of the London van attacks with the Quebec mosque shooting, for example, the Quebec mosque shooting, I remember the night that it occurred, and I think many Muslims we were in the same position, sitting terrified in front of our televisions, waiting for news. The CBC spent 5 minutes, a total of 5 minutes, covering the attack the night that it happened. Whereas we know when there was an attack in London, England by Muslims a few months later, it received 6 hours of continuous coverage. And so, CBC covered it for 5 minutes the night that it occurred. It continued replaying a previously taped segment discussing Trump's Muslim ban, on which one of the panelists, who I will not name, suggested that the reason why people are scared of Muslims is because they don't understand why we pray 5 times a day. And this statement, supposedly, interrogating Trump's Muslim ban, but perpetuating and promulgating Islamophobia in the very course of supposedly doing so, went unchallenged on air. So that was the kind of rank Islamophobia that we saw before, because people like organizations like ICLMG, you mentioned the letter from Muslims. There's been so much critique and pushback against this. I remember when the Christchurch mosque shooting happened, and the Globe and Mail just had a tiny box about it on their front page, and the majority of the page was just a big picture of the face of Bill Morneau, who was the finance minister of the time. More than 50 Muslims massacred in a mosque, and they didn't even think it was worthy of significant front page attention. But that received so much outcry. So many people wrote into the Globe and Mail to complain because the racism was so overt, it was so plain, it was impossible to ignore. And so they apologized for that. And in general, I think now perhaps media has become better at covering its tracks in the way that it in its entanglement or its responsibility, its implication in Islamophobia. So following the London attacks, we saw very sustained coverage of it, Muslim after Muslim after Muslim being interviewed. But I remember also, and I think this was the experience of many Muslims being interviewed on CBC, all they wanted to know about was our personal feelings about the attack. Like, of course we're scared. Of course we're horrified. Of course we're in grief. We're human. Why do you need to ask us about our emotions in order to verify the fact that we have normal human reactions like anyone else? The thing that they didn't want to talk about, again, were the deeper structures of militarism and national security, racism and colonialism that are responsible for producing these ideas in the first place. And I think, after the election of Trump in the United States, some activists saw a bit of a silver lining to it, in that it made the racism so plain that we had no choice to resist. And in some ways, it's much more difficult to mount resistance when the racism isn't worn like the blackface on Justin Trudeau's face, when it's not like an in-your-face punch, but instead it disguises itself behind a facade, most perniciously of anti-racism, which brings us back to some of the conversation that we're having before. And so I'm not sure that media Islamophobia is necessarily any less, as opposed to having shape-shifted in order to make it more difficult to identify and therefore more difficult to resist, which is exactly why we need to remain vigilant, engaging in constant scrutiny, constantly challenging these types of practices, which instead of dismantling racism, just recapitulate it in another form.
Thanks, Azeezah. I think that brings us to the end of our time, but I think that's also an excellent place to be able to end the conversation. Obviously, there's so much more that could be said, but I think that, I think that's a really powerful place to leave this. But yeah, thank you so much for everything you shared today, and it was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and for all the work that you and ICLMG are doing. You put in a plug for my website, but everyone really needs to go check out the ICLMG website. Back to the question, or someone asked about Robin asked about what we can do to address Islamophobia. Whenever there's a new piece of legislation that's put forward, my recommendation is always go to the ICLMG website to see what their analysis is about it. It's done in a way that's both rigorous and accessible, and provides invaluable guidance on how we should be intervening with respect to any of these state initiatives that are proposed. So thank you, Tim.
Thanks so much, Azeezah. Thanks.
And thank you, Jim.
Yeah, and then thanks so much, Jim, and everyone at the Center for Free Expression for organizing this. And I'll pass it back over to you, Jim.
Well, listen, thank you both very much. It was such a rich, powerful discussion. And there's so much more that we'd love to have time to be addressing it. We simply don't. So I want to thank you, Azeezah and Tim, so much. And I want to thank the audience for your engagement and for some wonderful questions. A video of today's conversation will be posted on the CFE website either late tomorrow or Friday morning. That's cfe.ryerson.ca. We'll also be posting resources for if you want to read more or see YouTube videos on some of the issues that were discussed. Azeezah mentioned a number of resources that people could turn to. We'll have a list of all those. So on our website, there'll be the video, and there'll be a link to click on for additional resources. And one that was mentioned in particular that I think is really valuable for people to know is the website Islamophobia-is.com. I'd encourage you to go there. There are wonderful resources there. Now, our next event is 2 weeks from today, and it's titled The Problem of Anti-Racist Discourse in Canada and the United States. The featured guest will be Anthony Stewart, who's author of a book entitled Visitor, My Life in Canada, in which Anthony discusses the lack of a recognizable Black anti-racist discourse in Canada, and why Canada's lack of expression and commitment to Black anti-racism led him to give up his full professorship at Dalhousie University to move to a small college in the United States. Anthony will be in conversation with Vershawn Young, an author, actor, and professor of English at the University of Waterloo, who specializes in African American studies, particularly in relation to gender, language, and performance. Their conversation will be exactly 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, October 5th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information about that event, as well as any of our other upcoming events or videos of our past events, go to our website, cfe.ryerson.ca. And again, thank you to the panelists and thank you to the audience for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot, Jim.